Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Group Theory Podcast. This is a show where we talk to working mathematicians about what it's like to do research for a living. My name is Logan.
My name is Michael.
And today we're joined by Dr. Akshaa Vatwani, postdoctoral fellow here at the University of Waterloo. Dr. Vatwani obtained her PhD from Queen's University in 2016 and already has over 10 publications. Without further ado, how are you doing today?
Good, nice. Yeah, that's a nice description.
Great. Yeah, well, we do our best.
Did we get everything right? 10 publications since 2010?
He said over 10.
Over 10.
Yeah, that's
oh,
good.
yeah, you were 14. Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
No, some of them are just submitted, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
right.
Of course, for sure.
Yeah. Hey, they count.
Yeah, exactly.
Put it on the resume.
Now, actually, I did have a question just before we kind of really jump into things.
Yeah.
So, you're not technically a professor, you're a postdoc.
Yeah.
So, what exactly does that mean? I know it's something you do after your doctorate, but, like, what is it?
Okay, so it's kind of like after your PhD, you need some experience just to start working independently and to get a bit of teaching experience before you apply for a real job. So that's what it's kind of like. Maybe you could think of it as an internship. You're gaining experience, which then will enable you to do better at your job. So at your tenure track job. So it's that kind of thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, but like, there's no like thesis requirement or anything like that. It's not like pass or fail kind of thing.
No. So it's just like so during your PhD you worked with your supervisor. So you had that you were under their wing. Now you kind of find your own path. You're doing your own research, and so there's no you don't have to supervise students yet, but you do have to start teaching and balancing your own research. So you're kind of getting started towards becoming a real professor in that sense. Yeah. So there's no hard and fast requirements as such, but you are expected to come up with some research during this time as a mark of your independence.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting, yes. So that being said, what is your field of research? And how would you describe it to someone that's not a math person?
Right. So I work in number theory. Mm-hmm. So the simplest thing I can say is I just study numbers. But so
you wouldn't be wrong.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, so let's suppose we just think of numbers as the integers that we studied during kindergarten. Then you can just think of like these integers have the prime numbers as their building blocks, because you have this factorization of integers as a product of prime numbers. So it turns out that there's a lot we don't know about the prime numbers. Like, we do know that there are infinitely many of them, but there's a lot of stuff we don't know, like how they are distributed, how far apart they might be, or how close together they might fall. So my research is focused on kind of trying to answer these questions, and there are like ways to go about it. So my research focuses on using analytic tools to answer these kind of questions. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe that's like one aspect. Another aspect that you can think of is you could just ask, what is a number? Is it what we have been looking at as integers, or are integers just special cases of a more generalized notion of a number? And if you do that, then you go into algebraic structures, and that's a different way of. And then you can ask questions about integers or numbers in those algebraic structures, whether they follow the rules that we expect in the classical situation. So that would take you into ideas, and so that
interesting. Out of curiosity, is there sort of an overlap between analytic number theory and algebraic number theory and the upper echelons of the theory? Like, is there a well-defined analytic algebraic number theory, or is it typically like well-partitioned?
It's becoming more and more mixed, I would say, especially with these kind of questions where you can ask what are fundamentally thought of as analytic questions, but you can ask them in these structures like rings. You can ask them for the ideals in these rings, and now their primes are your prime ideals, that kind of thing. In that case, you might be using analytic tools, but then there is an interplay with algebra. And so it's getting more and more fluid.
Unified?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. Mm-hmm. Also, another thing that we noticed when we were looking up information about you is that you study sieve theory, which is something that I don't think a lot of people are familiar with. It's sort of a more esoteric field of math. So would you like to describe that for a moment?
Okay, so how to describe sieve theory? Okay, you're interested in the prime numbers. Say that's what I am usually interested in. Or say you're trying to look at any kind of subset of the integers. Sieve theory is just a fancy name for like a bunch of techniques that use these kind of weighted functions. So they basically help you count what you want and throw away the rest. So it's like a physical sieve where you are left with only the primes or the subset that you are interested in. How do you conjure functions to do that, to help you make that sieve? That's how it works. So it's a family of techniques used to do this sort of thing. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Well, now when we were looking up, the thing you're working on currently, I believe, is like the zeros of the partial sums of L functions and the zeros of those.
Yeah.
So I wonder, is there an overlap between your work with sieves and that? Because it sounds like you could certainly have some kind of interplay between them if you're only looking at certain subsets of things, and then you're taking partial sums instead of the full infinite series.
Yeah.
Is there a relationship between what you're doing with sieves and L functions?
I'd say right now not very much. Actually what we're doing with partial sums of L functions is using a lot of complex analysis. So the main tools there are these contour integration methods, which we are kind of discussing in class right now. Sometimes you're using something that could be like a fundamental thing in sieve theory, but these are a bunch of different techniques that I'm using, so this is actually new for me too. I mean, till now I've been doing sieve theory, and this is slightly different from that. Yeah.
Okay. Now we have sort of a bit of a personal connection with the idea of partial sums of L functions because we were working on something similar.
Really?
A little bit, yeah. We noticed some geometrical patterns in the partial sums of L functions. Just, like observational stuff.
Nothing important.
Are you looking at Dirichlet L functions?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, you get those like those Cornu spiral patterns almost when you plot all the partial sums. We were kind of looking at the geometry of those.
So you plotted them like you plotted the values that they
so we fix S,
yes,
and we plot it as a function of the limit of the partial sum.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then it forms these spirals in the plane. Yeah. Have you seen them before?
Yeah, I've seen like them in slide talks.
Right. Okay. I didn't think we were the first to come up.
Yeah, no, we definitely weren't. There's a few papers, but I remember I found that in high school. That pattern, and so I just been like working on it whenever I have time since, and we were speaking with Dr. Rubenstein, and he was just like, yeah, this is not going to get you anywhere, but it's kind of cool. So good job.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Anyways, the reason I wanted to bring it up is because some of the things I guess in our approach we were wondering if there is any way we can study the limiting behavior of the zeta function or the partial sums of the zeta function as a tool for analyzing the zeros. Would you say that your work is similar to that, or have you noticed any like fundamental differences between the finite case and the infinite case?
So actually there are relations. This is for, if you talk about the Riemann zeta function, there is a connection between zeros of the Riemann zeta function and those of the partial sums. And this was I forgot who studied it first, but there is so there is a result which says that suppose you can show that each of these partial sums do not have zeros to the right of, say, real part S equal to 1, then the Riemann zeta function has no zeros to the right of real part S equal to half. So you can then prove the Riemann hypothesis using these zeros of the using the statement about zeros of the partial sums.
Interesting.
And this is a proper theorem. I forgot the name.
That's
yes.
okay.
And then it was shown by Montgomery that this theorem is actually vacuous because the first statement that you require for the zeros of the partial sums of the Riemann zeta function, that statement is not true. He proved that statement to be false. But it's interesting that there are connections, and like approaching partial sums could be a way of getting information about the function, and the Riemann zeta function also gives us information about the prime numbers, so there's a lot of connections there. This is something you can definitely look up.
There's that interesting theory about how the prime numbers and the zeros of the zeta functions are basically just Fourier transforms of each other, I think. Something similar to that.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, I was wondering if you had any insight into that. Okay, because I don't.
What we're trying to do is kind of replicate that with L functions, because people kind of gave up with this kind of an approach once they realized that is not true for the partial sums of the Riemann zeta function, but it's still interesting to have some connections. So in that sense, yes, it is related to getting back to the original function through the partial sums. Yeah.
Interesting. Would you say that there are, what's the most striking fundamental difference you've found between the infinite case and the partial case?
Between the partial sums are just much easier to handle.
Yeah.
I have no idea what to do with the infinite case.
Yeah.
So, it seems like there's something happening there which we're not able to put a finger on.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we'll move on then. So, when did you decide that math was kind of like the career path you wanted to follow?
Okay. So before my PhD, I did my master's and my undergrad in India. And before that, I was actually studying to be an engineer. So at that age, we were kind of conditioned to think of only two career choices in science. One was engineering and the other was medicine. Of course, I think in the last 10 years, a lot of stuff has changed in India also. But when I was growing up, this was the situation. So I started out preparing to be an engineer, and in the course of trying to give those entrance exams, we had to study maths, physics and chemistry. And while doing that, I really started liking the math part, and I started feeling that I want to study this theoretically without worrying too much about how to apply it to a physical system. And in my first year of undergrad, we had this real analysis course, and there I was floored. I mean, I met epsilon and delta for the first time in that course, and that was it for me. I knew I wanted to do this, and whichever way I could find to be able to study this later, I would do that. So that's when I really knew that I want to pursue a career in math.
Interesting. Yeah. I think you're the first person I've ever met who enjoyed epsilon delta.
Because whenever you teach students, now I find they hate it.
They hate it. Yeah. I think it just becomes so rote and tedious, because you do it basically. You drive it into the ground. You do it so many times.
One example, and then that's enough epsilon delta for me. Find a better way.
Yeah.
And then that leads into topology and open sets and stuff.
Yeah, I really like all that stuff.
But when did you pick number theory specifically? Was there a course in your undergrad or during your master's that really drove home, number theory is the direction I want to go?
No, so typically there are no number theory courses in undergrad. Typically, mostly it's a core algebra 1, algebra 2, analysis 1, analysis 2. Then there was for some reason topology, But I actually discovered number theory in a sense through summer projects. So I was kind of looking at what else can I do that's not in the courses and just learn something new. So I explored, I think, cryptography that way and number theory that way, and then I started liking number theory a lot. Yeah, that's how it went.
Okay, yeah. I find it interesting that you bring up that there was no number theory course in the undergraduate curriculum, because when I think about number theory, I don't really, as simple as it sounds on the surface, I can't picture any easy route to understanding it and analyzing problems in it. Everything simple seems so far and out of reach, like even something like Fermat's last theorem, stuff like that. Yeah. But by comparison to even topology, you start with basic, like, what is a topology, and you go into separability axioms.
So set topology. You can teach that.
Yeah, exactly. Number theory is much more sporadic. I don't know what the right word is.
I think either if you go the algebra route, then you need the algebra background, and if you go the analysis route, you need complex analysis at least.
Right.
So, I guess what could be done is like have an elementary number theory course.
Yeah, I think there is one here.
There's one here.
Yeah, it's PMath 330, isn't it?
Oh yeah, Urtan is teaching that. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Really? Oh, that's cool. We should get him on too.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's definitely the route to go.
So you all are not in that course, right?
No, I'm not in the number theory course.
Yeah. Okay.
Was it offered this term?
He's teaching that now.
So at the beginning, he was teaching both complex analysis.
Yeah.
That's funny. What is your first original mathematical result you remember producing, even if it wasn't published?
Okay. It was actually part of this number theory project that I was doing in the summer, and before it started, this professor, he asked me to kind of just go through some exercises to try to show some things, and this question was, so I'll just say the question. It is like, okay, you have a polynomial with integer coefficients, so f of x has integer coefficients. Now you know that this has roots in the complex numbers, but let's try to reduce this mod p. So you look at each of the coefficients as now whatever remainder you get mod p, and you look at this whole polynomial mod p, and you look at f of x congruent to 0 mod p, and you want to solve this. And the question was just to show that this is solvable for infinitely many primes p. So I remember like thinking a lot about this, and it's very nice because the statement is just so obvious. It should happen, right? And then there's no background that you really need to start attacking this problem. And I remember writing it down and trying to solve it and coming across like a few stumbling blocks and getting past them and finally being able to solve it. And I still have the notebook in which I did this. So I really remember this very vividly. And it was like it's a really nice feeling to be able to solve something. And it's not really a research project, but it was still like the first step, because using this you can show, for example, that there are infinitely many primes congruent to 1 mod any prime q. Things like this. So I really like doing this. But I had to do all this and then we started the project. So this was the first one that I started with.
Okay. Yeah. So what would you say then is your proudest mathematical achievement?
See, at this stage, I don't want to scare you, but I would say getting my PhD.
Okay. Why would you say that would scare us exactly? Because it's a long and arduous process?
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough, yeah. That explains why it's so proud.
But are you guys thinking of doing a PhD or?
Well, that's the plan. We'll see. we'll see if I can get in.
Okay. I would say that because it was this one thesis. 4 years went into getting that thesis out, and there were a lot of personal things also. Like my PhD is when I came here to Canada, so the first year was hard to live so far away from family and friends in India. So that, and I'd say also the thing was the convocation was really nice. Like my parents came over from India, and the ceremony and everything was overwhelming. So in that sense, that's what I remember well. So that was nice.
Yeah. Nice. Now, you mentioned that you came over here from India to do your PhD. What would you say were some of like the biggest culture shocks between here and India in terms of the way math was studied, if there was anything like that? Can you think of anything?
Math is studied.
Yeah. Can you think of any differences between the two cultures?
I could say in terms of the curriculum, I am surprised by some things that
Okay.
some things which are like the Ontario curriculum does not have integration in high school.
Right.
That was a shock to me because I was teaching calculus here for engineers first year, and we had half the semester was differentiation, which they already knew. Then the half was integration, which they did not know at all.
Yeah.
And to teach integration in just half a semester is difficult. You need a full semester for integration.
Or a Russian prof.
Yeah. So that
that's the biggest difference. Yeah.
those kind of small things that I thought that I just had to rescale my expectations based on the curriculum. I had to understand what was taught and what was not.
Right.
That
yeah.
kind of thing.
I think they do integration in high school in the U.S. though. Correct.
Yeah, and they also do it in Alberta because some students from Alberta were like, they knew it.
That's bizarre.
Okay,
wow.
yeah.
That's pretty cool. Yeah. But I remember I had a friend that goes to UCLA, and he was at my high school, and we did integration in high school because we happened to have a really good math prof.
Okay.
Or a math teacher. But he said that everyone in the U.S., though they knew integration, it was all just memory. And it was all they had a very poor understanding of how it was actually formulated or how it came about or how to use it in innovative applications. Right. So it's do you feel like it was when you learned integration in high school in India, was it taught in an appropriate way, or was it mostly like memorization?
Okay, I knew this much that it was area under the curve. I didn't know the formulas, of course.
Okay, I'm not expecting a limit formulation of it in terms of Riemann sums, but
Let me see, did we do that? Thing is, now it gets so confusing because I just mix up what we did. Okay. I think we may have done the Riemann sums approach, but I do not think I understood much of it.
Okay, fair.
Yes,
it's a difficult concept, yeah. So,
but it still helps because then you see it again and then it's better, right? It's not the first time. The first time you won't understand much anyway, I feel, at whatever age. So you should just teach it as early as you can.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it definitely takes a while to sink in.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so your proudest mathematical accomplishment was your PhD. What's the flip side of that question then is what's one problem that you haven't been able to solve yet or one that you kind of hope you'll be able to solve at some point in your career?
Okay, so there's this really cool, simple sounding problem, which is the twin prime problem.
Right.
Yeah.
So that is a dream.
Of course, that's the dream.
But yeah, I'm not hoping that that's too much to ask for, but yeah, I would wish. So it just says that there are infinitely many primes P, such that P plus 2 is also a prime. And that would be just the simple statement which I think everyone can understand. No one knows how to solve it. So.
Well, number theory is interesting like that because all the problems are super easy to say, and anyone with a basic understanding of what a number is can understand what the problem is. But then solving it is a completely other story.
Yeah.
I think a lot of us have heard about the things like the twin prime conjecture and the Goldbach conjecture and the Collatz conjecture and the things that are sort of like, I don't want to say mainstream in the mathematical community, but just like well spoken about.
And the Riemann hypothesis.
And the Riemann hypothesis. Are there any things that you've come across in your own research that you think aren't very well known but might rupture the very fabric of number theory, as you know, stuff of importance, of the same importance as the prime number or the twin prime conjecture, but not as well known? Anything you've come across?
Yeah, it's not that it's not mainstream, but it's not like it's not well known. So should I state it? It will be a little technical, but yeah, there are things.
You can think of a way to summarize it or distill it into its core problem that you could share. But yeah.
Okay, so the core problem would probably be take an integer, which is not divisible by a square. Okay, it's square free. So it's just a product of distinct primes. Now let's just run through all the integers which are like this, square free, and in a separate table let's just record the number of these distinct primes that divide that integer. So in the factorization, so for example 15 has factorization 5 into 3. So there are an even number of primes here. So you would just put a +1 for this to denote that the parity is even for the number of primes. Now keep doing this. Whenever you have an odd number of primes in the factorization, put a -1.
Are you describing the Mobius function?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just saying it.
Yeah, fair enough. Go
now
ahead.
you do this, and you take this integer, put this Mobius function recording this plus and minus ones on it, and one thing is that you can just run through all the integers up to some large x. But what you can also do is take n plus 1, n plus 2, do the same thing for all of them, and take the product, and now sum over n going up to some large number. So the idea is that if these +1s and -1s are really so random, this sum should eventually go to 0. Okay?
Right.
Okay, yeah.
It's a Mobius randomness kind of thing.
Interesting.
And this is thought to be very much connected to the twin prime conjecture. It's supposed to be as hard, and in fact I have some I've worked a little bit on this, and there is some evidence showing that if you could do this, you could solve the twin prime conjecture.
Wow.
Really? That's
There's
interesting.
That'd
a
be
thing going on here.
That'd be really cool if you could just like prove that conjecture and completely like usurp the title of solving the twin prime conjecture from that guy.
It's
What
just
was
a
his name?
pedagogy now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's funny. The twin prime conjecture is the corollary.
The theorem to prove all theorems.
That's what is this conjecture called?
So this is called the Chawla conjecture. Chawla, and there is also a generalization of it by Sarnak. So
So the Sarnak conjecture.
That would have a more technical description in terms of dynamical systems. So it's also connected to that sort of stuff.
Okay.
But Chawla conjecture will just give you the basic, the thing that I was describing here.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
It sounds kind of familiar to something that was I read about the summatory Mobius function, right? And it where it like we don't know if it crosses the 0 infinitely many times or something like that.
Okay.
Right, because you're adding ones and then -1s.
Okay. How many times it changes signs?
Yeah, exactly.
That is also that's also related. Yes.
Yeah. Is that solved? I'm not sure. I don't remember the name.
In some recently, there's been some work on this. In some special cases, this has been solved to some extent. There's some partial results.
Okay, interesting. Okay. Well, this is why I love this show. We get to talk about all the spicy bits of math.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, actually, I wanted to go back to the twin prime conjecture for a second.
Yeah.
Because I know that out of all the problems that mathematicians work on, like the twin prime conjecture probably has the largest community around it. Like, there's that huge movement. I think Terry Tao started it.
The polymath thing?
That might be what
project.
it is.
Yeah.
Yes, that's the one. And they're trying to, solve it. And then the method that they have got it down to something like, is it 6 now?
I believe it's 6. It's based off of the work of, who was that guy? Yang? I don't remember his name.
Yitang Zhang?
Yitang Zhang, that guy. Yeah.
But it's not 6. It's 6 under some conjecture.
Oh, okay.
Unconditionally, I think it's 246.
Okay, well, that's still pretty good.
We started with 70 million.
Yeah. But what's interesting to me about that specifically is that they've determined now that the method that they use to get it down to 6 conditionally on whatever that thing is won't continue to work to bring it down. And I wonder, is that just because of the theorem that they use to bring it down to the 6, or the conjecture they use to bring it down to the 6, or is there something about the method?
That is very closely related to it. It's about the method. The thing is, we don't know of any other method, and with the tools that we have, this seems to be a limitation. And this idea of this limitation goes back to something framed by Selberg called the parity problem, which is similar to what I was saying. It says that these methods, sieve methods, which are being used there, are not able to detect whether an integer has an even or an odd number of prime factors.
Right.
So that is the basic problem. And we are not able to get around it. And even that's the same problem faced with the summatory Morbius function, because you're essentially trying to do the same thing. You're trying to say that you should be able to detect, and so you should be able to detect that cancellation in the sum as well. So
interesting.
Both have the same limitation around them. Yeah.
Is this just a heuristic problem in sieve theory based on the arguments used, or is it a provable problem, like a provable limitation of the methods in sieve theory?
This is a heuristic.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So there is the potential for a sieve to exist that overcomes this parity problem?
Maybe, yes. I would not say that it's been proved that there is not.
Okay.
That's not the case.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And like before Zion, people thought that even the bounded gaps was out of reach, right? But he did do it, so you never know.
Right, yeah. Would you say you had a favorite theorem in number theory or in math in general?
So since we're doing complex analysis, so I really like analytic continuation. I don't know about you guys, but I like it.
It's interesting. I suppose. I had the opportunity of explaining why 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 all the way to infinity is equal in air quotes to negative 1/12. I had the opportunity to explain that to a physicist, because he was talking to me about how he thought that the number you get out of doing that calculation is actually negative 1/12, which is, and after learning about analytic continuation, it's not the right interpretation, and people need to stop saying that's correct. It's getting on my nerves.
Looking at you, number file.
1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 diverges. Let's get that clear.
Well, it's all these misleading titles to lure undergrads like you.
Well, actually, I am happy that Number File made that video, because it's something that I could understand as a high school student, and that really got me hooked on math.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think it got the point across that math is cool, even if it wasn't right.
It wasn't exactly right. Yeah. But I can definitely see the intrigue in analytic continuation.
Yeah, and I like the fact that the proof is not that complicated. Like, you
simple.
just know real analysis and you get the proof. So
it's really nice.
Yeah.
I
like that.
Yeah, it's cool. It's like a powerful theorem that doesn't require a lot of input effort.
Yeah, and it's telling you something so cool. It's telling you that if you know something locally about a function, then you have this global information too.
Yes.
You just need it to be complex differentiable.
Yeah.
So it's like a local global principle, which is really big in math. It's just a version of that.
That is big, and it is really interesting how the properties of holomorphic functions are so restrictive that you should know the behavior of a holomorphic function in the entire complex plane given a small section of the complex plane, which is really interesting.
Yeah, and that's something that, at least up till now, I don't know if in higher level math it becomes more common, but the global properties and local properties are very disjoint. It's very rare you see something connected to.
Yeah.
So I think analytic continuation is very cool.
Very cool. Yeah. Going back to, I don't know, I just noticed a little dichotomy between local and global, and what we were talking about before of finite partial sums and the infinite sum.
Yeah, so you're trying to do the same kind of thing. But
interesting, yeah. I wonder if there's an analytic continuation of logic, where if something if you know something is true on a dense subset of the input, then you know it's true everywhere.
I'd say that's statistics. I don't know.
You never know. Maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Well, I guess it's kind of, I don't know, I think this is mostly just kind of philosophy of math at this point.
Yeah.
But what you're describing kind of maybe sort of like what we were talking about with Dr. Musa, about model theory and category theory, and how you can solve a problem without ever touching it with category theory. So, I mean, maybe that's kind of the closest thing you'll get to a mathematically rigorous idea of analytic continuation of logic. But
American dream.
Yeah, exactly.
So how are you actually following the class? I see he knows his stuff. So.
Oh, I just like. I read a book. So like, yeah, I guess I'll just leave it at that. I was always like,
you just read on your own.
I just read on my own. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've never seen him go to class.
Really?
Yeah, and he gets 90s in every class.
Okay, so which book for complex analysis? Yeah.
So it was a book that how old am I right now? 19? Going on 20?
So.
Yeah, something like that. I got it when I was 9, I think. I was on some vacation with my parents. I think we were in like San Francisco or something. And we stopped in a bookstore because my dad loves bookstores. And I was interested in math at the time. And I saw this book that had this idea that I had never heard of. Complex numbers. I mean, I remember I always had like an ambitious set of friends in grade school that were always like, did you know about imaginary numbers? Dude, do you know there are numbers that don't even exist? Stuff like that, yeah. So I was like, oh, I'm going to show off these guys. I'm going to talk about complex numbers. And I remember like sitting there and reading like the first 2 pages about like adding complex numbers in the airport, and my mind was just blown at that point. So as a little 9-year-old, that you could add these 2-dimensional numbers. But so yeah, that's how I don't know why I got on this tangent, but just like the book is a really old book from like Cambridge, I think it's like a textbook from Cambridge that I just found really cheap in like some novelty bookstore. Yeah, so it's like, I don't know, I just really like finding like little like nuggets of knowledge around in interesting places. So that's how I'm keeping up with my course.
Complex analysis at 9.
Yeah. To be fair, I only got through like the first 10 pages up until I was about 15. Yeah, don't worry, I wasn't that smart. Yeah, let's get back on track.
Yeah, I guess
that was a fun tangent.
I guess we'll move on. Do you got any math jokes?
Just the one I told in class.
Oh, I missed it.
He missed it. Let's hear it again.
Okay, so it was, why did the mathematician call his dog Koshi?
Oh, I don't know. Alright, sounds funny.
You can answer.
I don't remember what it was.
That's too bad. Okay.
Call his dog Koshi?
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much stuff named. Oh, wait a minute. Something to do with the residue.
Yeah. They left a residue at every pole.
There we go.
But in the class, they already knew it.
Yeah.
So it was.
Oh, there you go. So that wasn't funny.
I think that's the best answer, though, to do you have a favorite joke we've gotten on the podcast? Most moms don't have jokes.
Ooh, yeah, hang on.
No, I actually listened to a few, and I got the same joke, that Obedient Grape.
Grape. That's pretty funny.
That one is good.
But it's the same. I saw at least 2 with the same joke.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, well, that's the classic math joke.
Yeah. Well, there was one more, I think.
Oh,
I don't know if you heard this one, but I just found it somewhere. But this is very common. How do math people scold their children?
I
How?
have no clue.
Okay, if I've told you n times, I've told you n plus 1.
That's pretty good.
That is good.
Would you say you have any mathematical heroes when you were studying math and growing, and to this day? Yeah,
so I would say one of the first ones that comes to mind is Ramanujan, because while growing up, I was exposed to his story first, and so it's pretty. It's a nice story, right? And he was, so he was this mathematician in India during the British rule, and he had no formal training. In fact, he failed all his subjects except math. So, and he just taught himself math by just doing like how you're doing, by solving as many questions.
He was a little better than me.
Well, okay, but he taught himself math, and the stuff that he wrote, to this day we are studying. I mean, it's still a mystery. People are going through stuff in his notebooks, and it is a source of research for mathematicians even to this day. So that's really fascinating that he was so much ahead of his time. Like, I don't know how
Absolutely.
it happened.
Yeah, every once in a while you come across like a figure that you have no clue how their brain could even manifest the things that it outputs, right? Like, it's just something fundamentally alien and unhuman about him that's interesting. I mean, because most of the time, when I look at, like, mathematical heroes or people in history, I can see some logical pattern or pathway that they might have taken to get to the innovations that they came up with, right? Ramanujan, absolutely no clue. He's completely beyond any sort of like rational thinking. It's almost to the point where it's like his math is like an art, like abstract art, right?
I think you could say the same for Terry Tao, right? I mean,
maybe, he's just a pure genius,
At least from like he was at the age of 4 or 5, he started doing these things. I mean, there's no way to explain how that happened.
Exactly, That's not like a rational pathway. That's just like unbridled genius, which is interesting. There's like I only know like a few people in history that are like that, not just in math, but like my dad is into poetry, and so one of the poets that he really admires is Hart Crane. Have you heard of him before?
No.
I wouldn't expect it. He's pretty like it's an esoteric figure, but the thing about him was just like it's the same sort of deal. It's like the formulation, the way he manages to put words together and sentences together and imagery and that blossoms out of that is unworldly. It's to the point where it's like everyone else in poetry is human by contrast, and so I think that's the same thing that Ramanujan had, which is really rare and interesting. So it's a cool figure. I kind of wanted to ask, is there any difference in how Ramanujan is perceived in India versus in America?
I'd say he's less famous in India.
Really?
In the non-mathematical community, definitely.
Yeah. Okay.
Because I don't know, but in the math community, he's as well known. And I mean, it's just I feel that the general level of exposure, like for the non-math people, I would expect that here maybe he's better known. That's the only thing.
Really? Okay.
For the non-math people.
Well, did you see the movie, The Man Who Knew Infinity? It came out 2 years ago?
Yeah, so I didn't see the movie, but I read the book before that.
Oh, yeah?
How was the book?
The book is nice. I mean, it gets a bit slow in parts, but it's you get a really thorough, exposure to what he did, like at each step of the way, which book he read and what he did, and how many people he actually wrote to before writing to Hardy. I mean, how many rejections he received before that from people, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I've heard the movie's pretty good.
It's alright, yeah.
63% on Rotten Tomatoes.
A lot of people don't like math, I guess.
It still says 95% like this film, so I don't know. Maybe worth checking out.
Yeah, I mean, I liked it. I mean, there's not a lot of math movies, so it's nice when they make one.
Right. Yeah.
You got A Beautiful Mind about John Nash.
Oh yeah, I really like that too.
That's a good movie. Yeah. Well, it's like math is sort of just like the setting in that. I wouldn't say it's about math.
It's not about math.
It's more about the mathematician and like the psychological troubles that he went through.
That's
great. The one thing I must say I liked about that movie was the portrayal of mathematicians in the beginning, because they seemed like jocks and like buff, buff, cool students, as opposed to what they seem to be portrayed as nowadays.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, I think math was certainly more respected back in the day.
A little bit, probably.
Yeah, I really like that scene where they ask him for. I mean, he finally gets asked by someone to sign. That's a really important scene, right?
Was that at the very end?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yes, that's, they give him the pens.
That,
Right,
But
that was a good movie.
Yeah, I think that was nice, and I saw it at a very young age. And the thing is that my parents are psychiatrists, so they wanted me to see it for a different reason.
Interesting.
And then I
That's
really
cool.
liked the math part. Yeah.
Huh. That's really neat.
Interesting.
But speaking of heroes, there's this other end too, right? There's this mathematician that we discussed, Yi Tan Zhang. Like, if you know of his story, like he did have formal training up to PhD, and then he did do his entire formal training, but then after PhD he had trouble finding a job, right? For so many years he was just unemployed, and he was not employed mathematically.
Yes.
And then he was doing these odd jobs, and he was working at a subway. So he's inspiring too. More realistically inspiring in that sense, because he was not a prodigy.
Yeah, exactly.
He was just this unknown mathematician who worked on this problem for a very long time.
Yeah.
And he just made this breakthrough that no one else did.
Yeah.
So that was really nice. And,
Well, it's interesting because I think, and we've talked about this before, but it seems like there's almost like two different types of mathematicians. There's the ones that, will just work on like 5 problems at once and just kind of like, jump from thing to thing to thing.
Yeah.
And then there are the other ones who will just bunker down for like 2 decades on one problem, like Pellerman with Poincaré. Now, it begs the question, what do you see yourself closer to? Someone who will work on one problem for a long time or jump between?
So at this stage of my career, I would say I would be the jumping type, because there are practical considerations at play. Right?
Oh, yes, of course.
Show something. You can't just say, oh, I'm working on the Riemann hypothesis and I'm just going to do that for 10 years. But so that's why I don't know if Yichang Zhang had a job, say a regular job, and he had this requirement to produce maybe 2 papers a year or something. Would he have done the same thing? I don't know. So depends on where you are. If you are that secure and in your profession, and then you do this because you have always wanted to solve this problem, at that stage maybe you can. So I'm not there yet. Maybe, hopefully, but now this is the thing. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's certainly a little bit more comfortable, for a normal human being.
Yeah.
No.
Well, actually, would you say that it's more stressful now with having to deal with like research, I guess, quotas, as opposed to during your PhD? What was more stress on your life?
More stress. Okay, I'd say postdoc, but that's probably because this is a 2-year postdoc. So essentially what happens is you have to be doing something within the first 1.5 years, because by the time you apply, you apply after one and a half years, right? So you're essentially getting that much time. Maybe a 3-year postdoc might be different. So for me, it's been the postdoc, because then you have to balance teaching and research, and you're on your own. Yeah. So
they just kind of throw you off the deep end.
Yeah.
Okay.
We've talked a lot about mathematics as a creative form today, I think, and about its, how it shows up in art as well. And that leads us to a question that we ask everyone that comes on the show. Do you see mathematics as more of an art or a science?
Yeah, I'd say, I don't know if this is a cliche thing to say, but it's the perfect combination, I would say, because, okay, it has this artistic aspect. You have this creative process for research and the tools that you're going to use, etc. But in terms of the syntax, in terms of the language that you're doing this in, it's very, very precise. The syntax of mathematics is just very scientific and very precise. So there's a lot of logic there, and that part is very scientific. And then you have this artistic side, and of course on the artistic side you might have these flashes of inspiration that you suddenly get an idea in the middle of nowhere. But those two, I feel, a lot of the time are substantiated by this prolonged thought that you have put into it before that, where you didn't get anywhere. It didn't seem like you reached any, you made any progress with that amount of thought, but subconsciously it's there, and then you get these flashes. So the discipline that goes into the art is very scientific. So you do need that amount of discipline like you would for science, and then there is of course this very rewarding artistic side.
Right. Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, I think it's interesting because if you think about art, there's a whole bunch of different mediums it comes in, but the one thing that they all have in common is that they have a certain amount of rules. Like painting has to be done on a canvas, for example, or acting has to be done on a stage or on film or something like that. There needs to be an audience, and there's like rules. And in these traditional kind of art forms, those rules are open themselves up to being broken more frequently. But I think math is almost in the same sense. We got these rules, and then it's up to us to play within those rules, bend them as far as they'll go, break them if there's the opportunity to, in order to come up with it. So I think in that sense, it 100% is an art form. But I get what you're saying too about it being very scientific in its presentation, I guess.
Yeah.
I have to say, I think I like your description of math versus being an art versus science the best that we've had so far on the show, just in my opinion. Well, because I've been thinking about it a lot myself recently as well, and it's difficult to call math an art. I think there's creativity in math, but to call it an art is positing a lot of things about it that are stretches, in my opinion. Like art has an audience. You know, I would say art is about life, whereas math is about science, right? And there are flashes of creativity in math, and you mentioned breaking the rules, right? And I think in math, breaking the rules is more consequential than breaking the rules in art. Like breaking the rules in art can be a new form of art. Breaking the rules in math isn't necessarily a new form of math. And
I'd counter that actually because you get the hyperbolic geometry by breaking the Euclid's fifth postulate. You break that and you have it's math, but it's a new form of math. Like you couldn't do that math without it.
Right. Yeah. It's also a systematic break in math, right? It's an analysis of the axioms of geometry and seeing which ones can be lifted without causing any contradictions, right? I think that's how it came about when who's the guy that first did it? Bonyakowski or something like that. I don't remember. Some Russian guy. But the thing that I find distinguishing about math from an art is whenever I talk to my dad, I try to explain a concept in math that is very artistic. Like, I can't come up with anything off the top of my head, but we have conversations about it on occasion, and I'll explain to him, and he'll be amazed. He'll be like, "Wow, that's beautiful," And then he has very little understanding of math at a rigorous level. He just enjoys when I talk about it, and he'll often try to add something, it'd be like, so maybe you can do this with the complex numbers, and then it's like a wave, and I'm like, no, not really. It's very creative of you, but there's a lot that is. It's like art is more like flying. Free flowing. Yeah, free flowing. It's like water flowing through a river or water flowing in the ocean versus water flowing in the tendrils of a river. I think there's creativity and flow, but it's much more like you said, rigorous. Yeah. Well, it was a fun discussion.
Yeah. Well, I think we could probably talk about it all day, but it looks like we're just about out of time. So we've got one final question for you. Okay. And that is, what advice could you give to us aspiring mathematicians?
So I don't know this one because I've just finished my PhD. So
that's true.
I don't know, but I would just say explore areas and know what you want to do. Explore different topics, but it really looks like you guys are doing that. Just go beyond the course level and try to explore topics and see what really interests you in math. And getting a kind of a flavor to research is also useful, through your maybe some undergrad study, research summer project kind of thing, because doing research is a lot more different than doing a course on that topic. So it requires a lot more patience because you might not be getting anywhere, and you should know the kind of feeling that you get when you do that. And just so getting some exposure to doing some kind of research project is a good idea to know how different it is from just your usual course level stuff. Yeah.
All right. Okay.
That's all I
That's
can
good advice.
say.
Okay, yeah, that's
Yeah.
great advice.
All right.
Well, thank you very much for coming on the show. We appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yeah.